You won't believe the story I'm about to tell you. This ain't one of those happy campfire tales. This is a story from the deep woods, the kind that gets buried by time, by silence, and by the ancient mountains themselves. It's a story that's been whispered about for generations, a story that proves that the darkest shadows sometimes come from a place you'd least expect. It all went down in 1834, in a place that wasn't even a state yet. It was just the western chunk of Virginia, a land of deep valleys and mountains so thick with trees that the sun barely kissed the ground. This was Greenbrier County. Life here was hard, predictable. Families lived miles apart, connected by winding, dangerous trails. You knew your neighbors. You had to. Out here, you depended on each other to survive the winters, winters that could turn the world into a white graveyard. And in this isolated world lived the Hadley family. The patriarch, Isaiah Hadley, was a bull of a man, 42 years old with shoulders forged by a life of hard labor. His wife, Martha, was 38, known far and wide for her skill with herbs. Some respected her for it. Others feared it. They had 7 children. 7. Jacob, the oldest, was 19. Then Rebecca, 17. Thomas, 15. Mary, 13. Samuel, 11. Elizabeth, 9. And the baby, little Hannah, just 5 years old. Their homestead was nestled in the Sinking Creek Valley, a strange place where the creek would just vanish into the earth, only to pop up again miles away. Their house was dark wood, 2 stories high, a sign of some prosperity. Behind it, a barn. And beyond that, nothing but forest. Their closest neighbors, the Coopers, lived 2 miles up the trail. After that, you wouldn't see another soul for 10, maybe 12 miles. The Hadleys were self-sufficient, devout. They kept to themselves and worked their land. But in late October of that year, something changed. A cold snap came early. The leaves fell fast, and a thick, heavy mist started rising from the valley every morning. A mist so stubborn it wouldn't burn off till noon. The animals were jumpy. The crows wouldn't stop cawing. People felt it in their bones. Something was wrong. On the morning of October 28th, Samuel Cooper, the neighbor's eldest son, passed the Hadley place on his way to Lewisburg for supplies. He saw Isaiah in the field, waved, and Isaiah waved back. He saw Martha on the porch, watching the kids play. Everything was normal. But when Samuel returned the next evening on the 29th, the homestead was silent. Deathly silent. There was no smoke from the chimney, and the nights were already freezing. He slowed his horse, a chill running down his spine that had nothing to do with the air. He called out, "Isaiah! Martha!" Nothing. The pigs were squealing in their pen, frantic with hunger. The chickens were scattered in the yard, something Martha never allowed. Samuel slid off his horse, his heart pounding a drum against his ribs. The front door was ajar, just slightly creaking in the wind. He pushed it open. "Hadley's!" The main room was a wreck. Chairs were overturned, dishes shattered on the floor. A heavy stew pot was knocked over near the cold stove, its contents already starting to sour. Martha had been cooking dinner, but no one was there. Not Isaiah, not Martha, not one of the 7 children. He ran upstairs, room to room, beds unmade, clothes tossed about, but empty, all of it, empty. He bolted to the barn, yelling their names until his throat was raw. Nothing. It was as if 9 people had simply been erased from the earth. Samuel didn't wait. He leapt on his horse and galloped home, terrified, waking his father and 3 other men. They grabbed torches and rode back, plunging into the darkness of the Hadley homestead, looking for any sign, any clue. What they found would only deepen the horror. The flickering light of their torches painted dancing, monstrous shadows on the walls of the Hadley house. This was no longer a neighborly check-in. This was a search. Thomas Cooper, Samuel's father, was a practical man. He'd seen bear attacks. He'd seen feuds end in bloodshed. But he had never, in his 56 years, seen anything like this. In the main room near the fireplace, the torchlight caught something on the floor. dark stains. Someone had tried to scrub them clean into the hardwood, but you could still see the outlines. No one said the word. They didn't have to. They all knew what it was. Blood. They moved to the children's rooms. In the one Rebecca and Mary shared, the beds were torn apart. The sheets were ripped clean off, and a pillow had been slashed open, goose feathers scattered across the floor like a bizarre, silent snowfall. It was a scene of pure violence. In the kitchen, the clean knife lay on the floor, dropped, as if in a sudden, terrible shock. Thomas Cooper ran his hand along the doorframe. No marks, no signs of a forced entry. He checked the windows, one by one. All intact, all latched from the inside. This wasn't a break-in. This meant one of two things, and neither was good. Either someone in the family had opened that door to let evil in, or they had opened it trying to escape something that was already inside with them. As the sun began to bleed over the mountains on October 30th, more men arrived. News travels fast in the hollows, especially bad news. Soon, 15 men were gathered in the yard, their faces grim. They organized into search parties. One group took the trail north. Nothing. Just Samuel Cooper's horse tracks. A second group went down to Sinking Creek. The water was low, the muddy banks exposed, a perfect place to find footprints. They walked for miles, checking the small caves dotting the hillside. They called out the Hadley names until the echoes themselves sounded tired. The silence that answered them was heavy, oppressive. It felt like the woods were holding their breath. The third group, led by a hunter named Joshua Miller, pushed into the dense forest behind the barn. This was dangerous country, full of hidden ravines and sudden drop-offs. They moved slow, guns ready. About 300 yards in, Miller stopped dead. He pointed. Snagged on a thorny branch was a piece of fabric, a scrap of blue cloth, the exact kind of homespun dress Martha Hadley was known to wear. It was torn, jagged, as if ripped off by someone running for their life. A spark of hope, or was it dread, shot through the group. They fanned out, pushing deeper. 50 yards later, another piece, then another. It was a trail of blue fabric leading them deeper and deeper into the suffocating woods. The trail led them into a small, unnaturally quiet clearing. In the very center was a large, flat stone, the kind hunters sometimes used as a cutting table. On the stone, arranged in a perfect, horrifying line, were 7 objects. The men crept closer, their boots crunching on the dead leaves. They were dolls, 7 dolls made of straw and cloth. Each one was a different size, from largest to smallest, mirroring the Hadley children. The largest doll, the one for Rebecca, was wearing a scrap of the same blue cloth they had been following. The smallest doll, Hannah's, was wrapped in a piece of faded green fabric, the exact color of the dress she always wore. Joshua Miller, his hand trembling, reached out and picked one up. It was damp, fresh. Someone had been here, recently. He turned the doll over, and his blood ran cold. Sewn into the back with black thread were crooked, angry letters. They spelled out 2 words. They saw. One by one, they checked the other dolls. They know. They told. They must be silent. A wave of panic seized the men. This wasn't bears. This wasn't a kidnapping for ransom. This was something else, something dark, something that had been watching the Hadleys, something that wanted to send a message. They ran back to the homestead, clutching the dolls, their minds racing. Who had done this? And why? But the most terrifying question of all was the one nobody dared to ask. Where were Isaiah, Martha, and their 7 children now? The news hit the town of Lewisburg like a thunderclap. Sheriff William Thornton was a 61-year-old veteran of the War of 1812. He'd seen men torn apart by cannon fire. He was not a man easily shaken. But the story these men told about 9 vanished people and 7 cryptic dolls chilled him to the bone. He gathered 6 men, including the town physician, Dr. Elias Peyton, and they rode through the night, torches held high, arriving at the Hadley homestead just after midnight. Thornton was methodical. He walked the house, room by room, his sharp eyes missing nothing. Dr. Peyton went straight to the stains on the floor. He knelt, scraped a sample into a glass vial, and held it to the light. His face tightened. "It's human blood, Sheriff," he said, his voice low. "Not a lot. A head wound, maybe, a deep cut. But it was deliberately scrubbed. Someone tried to hide this." Thornton nodded grimly, his mind already working. He moved to the girl's room, the one with the feathers. He knelt by Rebecca's bed, lifting the fabric skirt. And there, tucked against the floorboards, was a small, leather-bound book. Rebecca's diary. He flipped to the last entry. It was dated October 28th, the day Samuel Cooper had last seen them all alive. Thornton read the first few lines aloud. Talk of cold weather, baking bread, normal, trivial. But then the handwriting changed. It got hurried, frantic, the letters slanting, almost running off the page. "Father's been acting strange since he came back from the woods yesterday. He won't talk to anyone. He just stares at the mountains. Mother is worried. Jacob heard strange sounds from the barn last night. He said it sounded like someone crying. When we went to look, there was no one. I'm scared." A murmur of unease went through the men. Isaiah? Crying in the barn? Thornton locked eyes with his deputy. "Search that barn again," he commanded, "top to bottom. Look for anything out of place." Two men rushed to the barn. They'd all searched it before, but now, with the diary's words hanging in the air, they searched with new eyes. They tossed aside hay bales, moved sacks of seed, checked every dark corner. One of them, Albert Green, stepped on a floorboard near the back wall. It gave. Just slightly, but it made a hollow sound. He dropped to his knees, prying at it with his knife. It wasn't nailed down. It was loose. He and his partner gripped the edges and lifted. Underneath was a dark, hollowed-out space dug into the packed earth. Their torchlight fell on what was inside, and both men recoiled. Stifling cries. It was a cache of horrors. There were small bones, animal bones, maybe and maybe not. There was a dark, leather-bound book, much older than the diary, its pages filled with cramped, spidery writing and strange diagrams, and next to it, glinting in the light, was a necklace made of human teeth. 23 teeth, strung on a raw leather cord. They carried the unholy discovery back to the house and laid it on the kitchen table. The room, which hours ago just felt sad, now felt poisoned. Dr. Peyton, his hands shaking slightly, opened the old leather book. The first few pages were in an old, spittery script. Notes on herbs, teas, ointments. But as he turned the pages, the writing became more frantic. Strange symbols appeared, circles within circles. And then, on a center page, a name and a date. Sarah Blackwood, 1796. Peyton looked up at the sheriff. "Does that name mean anything to you, Thornton?" The sheriff's face went pale. "My God," he whispered. "Sarah Blackwood. I remember the stories from when I was a boy. She was hanged. Hanged right in Lewisburg in 1797, on charges of witchcraft. They said she made a pact with dark forces. They said she caused the deaths of half a dozen children in the next valley over." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the men. They stared at the book, at the teeth, at the bones. Why did Isaiah Hadley, a devout, church-going man, have the book of a condemned witch hidden under his barn floor? As the men were trying to process this, one of the guards who'd been posted outside burst through the door, his face white as a sheet. "Sheriff," he stammered, you need to see this. Now." They followed him out into the freezing pre-dawn air, past the yard, to the edge of the forest. He pointed to a massive oak tree. Someone had been there. Someone had been there while they were searching the barn. Carved deep into the bark, the sap still weeping from the wounds like dark tears, was a message. The letters were jagged, angry. It read, "The blood of the mountain claims what is its own. 9 souls to calm the ancient hunger. The pact is renewed." Sheriff Thornton stared at the words, his blood turning to ice. This wasn't a search for a missing family anymore. This was a race against something he couldn't understand. Something ancient, something hungry, and something that had just declared in no uncertain terms that it had taken 9 souls. The case had just cracked wide open, revealing a pit of darkness none of them were prepared for. The carved message on the oak tree shifted everything. This wasn't a simple crime. This was a declaration. Sheriff Thornton, standing in the cold dawn, knew he was in over his head. He looked at the faces of the local men. Fear, anger, and a creeping superstition he knew could unravel this community. He had to get control. "All right," he barked, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. "We need answers. Thomas Cooper, you were his neighbor. Tell me about Isaiah. What was he into?" Cooper twisted his hat in his hands. "Isaiah, he was a quiet man, Sheriff. Always was. But the last month, he was gone. Not physically, but in his head, just staring off. I saw him at church 3 weeks back. I tried to talk about the harvest, the winter. He just looked through me, kept staring at the mountains like he was expecting to see something marching right out of him." "And Martha?" Thornton pressed. "She was scared," Cooper said simply. "A woman doesn't need to say words to show fear, Sheriff. It was in her eyes. The children, too. Quieter, not like kids should be." Just then, Joshua Miller, the man who'd found the dolls, stepped forward. "Sheriff, I saw Isaiah. About 10 days ago, he was walking that high trail, the one that leads nowhere but up into the rocks. He was carrying a heavy pack. I called out, asked where he was headed. He just looked back at me, his eyes dark. He said, 'To settle old business.' Then he turned and kept walking. Didn't look back." "To settle old business," Thornton muttered. That, combined with Rebecca's diary entry about him acting strange after coming from the woods, painted a dark picture. Isaiah Hadley was at the center of this. But was he a victim, or was he a participant? Meanwhile, Dr. Peeton hadn't moved from the kitchen table. He was lost in Sarah Blackwood's book. "Sheriff," he called, his voice tight, "you need to see this." Thornton hurried back inside. Peeton pointed to one of the last pages. It was a list of 17 names written in faded brown ink. Beside each name was a date. The first was Elizabeth Warren, 1793. The last name on the list, written in fresher, darker ink, was Isaiah Hadley, 1834. A cold dread, sharper than the mountain air, settled in Thornton's stomach. His name is in the book," Thornton said. "It was written this year." He scanned the other names. A few were vaguely familiar. Names of families who had lived in these mountains decades ago. Families who, now that he thought about it, had all met tragic ends, disappeared, died in fires, accidents that at the time seemed like just hard mountain luck. "We need to know who these people were," Thornton said, his voice hard as iron. "Get a team to Lewisburg, search the county archives. I want to know about every name on this list." He then turned to Miller. "And you take 6 men. I want you to follow that high trail. Find out what old business Isaiah Hadley was settling." The group that headed up the high trail was a hardened bunch. Experienced hunters, men who knew these woods, but none of them were prepared for what they found. The trail climbed for hours, getting steeper, the woods growing darker, quieter. The birds stopped singing. The squirrels vanished. It was, as one man later said, like the forest itself was dead. After 4 hours of brutal climbing, they reached a rocky, windswept plateau, and in the center of it, they saw it. A circle of standing stones, each about 3 feet high, arranged with a disturbing mathematical precision. The ground inside the circle was blackened, charred, covered in layers and layers of old ash, and mixed in the ash were tiny fragments of bone. One of the men, Silas Wright, pointed to the far side of the plateau. Over there. Look. It was an opening in the rock face, a cave, almost perfectly hidden by thorn bushes. They looked at each other, their faces grim. Nobody wanted to go in, but they all knew they had to. They lit torches and stepped into the darkness. The cave was deep, the ceiling dropping so low they had to crawl. The air grew cold, damp, and thick. After 20 yards, it opened up into a large natural chamber. The torchlight illuminated the walls, and the men froze. The walls were covered in paintings, not old native paintings. These were fresh, crude, drawn with charcoal and something that looked like blood. They showed human figures, always in groups of 9, always surrounded by the same strange symbols from Sarah Blackwood's book. And then they saw the floor. Arranged in another perfect circle were 9 mounds of stones. Each mound was the approximate size and shape of a human body. With trembling hands, the men began to remove the stones from the first mound. They didn't have to dig deep. They found rotting cloth, and under it they found bones, the skeletal remains of a person buried here years ago. Attached to the bones, on a corroded chain, was a silver locket. They pried it open. Inside was a lock of brown hair and a tiny engraved name. Elizabeth Warren, 1787. Elizabeth Warren, the first name on the list in Sarah Blackwood's book. The men stared at each other, the horror dawning on them. This was a graveyard. This cave was where the people on the list ended up. And if Elizabeth Warren was in the first mound, what was in the other 8? And if Isaiah Hadley's name was the last on the list, what did that mean for the 9 missing members of his family? The search party descended the mountain in a state of shock. The silence of the dead woods had seeped into them. When they reached the Hadley homestead at dusk, they found Sheriff Thornton waiting, his face just as grim. The news from the archives in Lewisburg had arrived, and it was bad. Of the 17 names on Sarah Blackwood's list, they'd found records for 13. Every single one had either disappeared or died under bizarre, violent, and unexplained circumstances over the last 40 years. Elizabeth Warren vanished in 1793. Jonathan Pierce burned alive in his cabin in 1798. Mary Sullivan disappeared on a 1-mile walk to her neighbor's house in 1802. It was a chain of tragedies, a pattern of death stretching back decades. "Look at the dates," Thornton said, his finger tracing the list. "There's a gap between each one. 5 years, 4 years, 2, 7. It's not random. It's a calendar, a schedule." Dr. Peeton, who had been poring over the witch's book, looked up. "I think I know why," he said. "The book, it's full of references to lunar cycles, to star alignments. Sarah Blackwood wrote that certain rituals could only be performed when the celestial conditions were right. She called it the blood covenant of the mountains, and it required periodic renewal." He paused, then said the word that had been hanging in the air: sacrifice. The pieces were slamming into place, forming a picture of unimaginable horror. A string of ritual murders, orchestrated by someone or something, had been happening in these mountains for 40 years. And Isaiah Hadley, their quiet, devout neighbor, hadn't just stumbled upon it. He was part of it. But how? Why? What could drive a father of 7 to this? Thornton knew his next stop. If anyone knew Isaiah's spiritual state, it was the man who heard his confessions. They had to see Reverend Abel Morrison. Morrison was an old man, 73, and he'd led the small wooden church in the valley for 30 years. When Thornton and his deputies arrived, the Reverend opened the door before they even knocked, his face a mask of grief and something else: guilt. "I've been waiting for you, Sheriff," he said, his voice trembling. I knew I should have spoken up. Come in." Sitting in his dim, candle-lit study, the Reverend told his story. "Isaiah came to me 2 months ago. He was a man possessed, feverish. He said he'd found something in the woods while hunting, buried under a stone with strange markings. The book, Thornton said. Morrison nodded. Sarah Blackwood's book. He was obsessed with it. He kept coming back, asking about her, about the trial, the execution. I told him what I knew, that Sarah was accused of killing 6 children, that when they hanged her, she didn't deny it. She laughed. She said the pact wouldn't die with her, that others would come to continue the work. The Reverend's hands were shaking so hard he could barely lift his glass of water. Isaiah asked me if I believed in curses, if a pact could be passed down, if it could choose you. I told him no. I told him it was superstition, that faith was his shield. But he wasn't convinced, Morrison whispered, tears welling in his eyes. The last time I saw him 3 weeks ago, he said something that has haunted me every night since. He said, Reverend, what if the pact isn't something you choose? What if it's something that chooses you? What if the only way to protect your family is to take someone else's place? Thornton felt a cold dread clamp around his heart. Take someone else's place. What did he mean? I asked him, Morrison wept. He just shook his head and left. And I let him go. I let him walk out that door. There's more, the Reverend said, his voice cracking. He walked to a shelf, pulled down a small wooden box and opened it. It was full of letters, all in Isaiah's frantic, sloping handwriting. He sent these to me. I hid them. I thought they were the ravings of a sick mind, but now I see. They were a confession. Thornton grabbed the letters. The writing was wild, barely legible. He read passages aloud. The voices in the mountains won't stop. They call to me. They say my family is marked, that the blood debt must be paid. If I don't obey, something worse will come for us all. He grabbed another. I have met the others who came before me. Their remains rest in the sacred chamber. Each tried to flee, each failed. There is no escape, only the choice of when and how. Then he found the last letter. It was dated October 28th, the day before the disappearance. Forgive me, Reverend, forgive me, God, but I cannot let others suffer for my cowardice. If 9 souls are required, then let them be mine and the ones I love. At least then we control our destiny. At least we will not be hunted. When the moon changes phases tomorrow night, I will take my family to the mountain. We will do what needs to be done. And maybe, just maybe, this will break the cycle forever. The room spun. The truth was 1,000 times worse than anything they had imagined. There was no monster. There was no kidnapper. Isaiah Hadley, driven mad by a witch's book and a supposed curse, had led his own family to that mountain, to that cave. Thornton stood up, overturning his chair. We're going back up that mountain, he roared. Now. It's been 7 days, but the children, Martha, maybe someone escaped. Maybe someone is hiding. Dr. Peaton put a hand on his arm, his face etched with sorrow. Sheriff, 7 days, in this cold, without food or water, even if they did escape the chances. I don't care about the chances, Thornton yelled. We are going! A group of 12 men was assembled in minutes. They grabbed blankets, water, food, and ropes. They set out at dusk on October 31st, Halloween night, following the trail markers back up to the plateau, their hearts pounding with a terrible, desperate hope. They reached the rocky plateau around 10 o'clock at night. A full, brilliant moon hung in the sky, washing the stone circle in a ghostly silver light. The air was frigid still. The men's breath plumed in front of them. The first thing they noticed was the ash pit in the center of the stones. It was fresh. Someone had lit a massive fire there, and recently. The smell of charred wood hung heavy in the air. They moved to the cave, guns drawn, torches high. The footprints they'd seen before were still there, but now they saw them with horrifying clarity. Adult boots, smaller shoes, and the tiny shuffling prints of a small child, all leading into the cave, none leading out. Thornton entered first. The air inside was different. The damp, earthy smell was gone. It had been replaced by a cloying, sickly sweet odor, an odor every man there, from the sheriff to the hunters, recognized immediately. It was the smell of death. They pushed through the narrow passage, their shoulders scraping the rock, until the tunnel opened into the main chamber. The torchlight flooded the space, and they saw them. The 9 burial mounds had been dismantled. The ancient bones from within them had been carefully, ritually arranged in a large circle on the cave floor, and in the center of that circle of ancient skeletons arranged like the petals of some grotesque flower lay the 9 bodies of the Hadley family. Isaiah was in the very center, flat on his back, his eyes wide open, staring at the cave ceiling with a look of terrifying peace. Around him, in a perfect circle, were Martha and their 7 children. All of them were dressed in their Sunday best, their clean church clothes. All of them were dead. Dr. Peaton fell to his knees, his medical bag dropping to the dirt. He moved from body to body, his hands gentle, checking for any sign of life, though he knew it was hopeless. "No wounds," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "No signs of violence, no struggle at all." He examined little Hannah, her face pale and peaceful, her hands folded on her chest. "It's as if they were all just put to sleep." In Isaiah's hand, clutched tightly to his chest, was Sarah Blackwood's book. Thornton carefully pried it from the dead man's rigor mortis grip. A new page had been added, the ink still dark, written in Isaiah's clear, steady hand. "On the 29th day of October, 1834, I fulfilled the covenant. 9 souls I gave willingly so that the cycle could close, my own life and the lives of those I love. There was no pain. I gave them the tea of the herbs the book described. They slept peacefully. Then I drank the same. If you are reading this, know I did what was necessary. May God have mercy on my soul, for I have none." Beside the book was a small, empty glass vial. Peaton uncorked it and sniffed. "Belladonna," he said, his voice heavy. "Nightshade, mixed with other herbs, a powerful sedative. In this dose it would cause deep sleep, then respiratory arrest. They truly wouldn't have suffered, at least not physically." One of the men near the entrance called out, his voice shaking, "Sheriff, the walls." They turned their torches to the paintings. New markings had been added in fresh, wet blood. Among the old symbols, Isaiah had drawn 9 new figures, all holding hands in a circle, and above them he had written a final desperate plea. "Let this be the last sacrifice." The men, hardened hunters and veterans, wept. They wept as they wrapped the small, cold bodies of the children in blankets. They wept for the futures stolen not by a demon, but by a father's love, twisted by fear and superstition into a horrific, murderous act. The long march down the mountain, carrying the 9 bodies, took the rest of the night. When they arrived back at the Hadley homestead, the sun was rising, and the rest of the community was there, waiting. When they saw what the men were carrying, a collective wail rose from the crowd, a sound of such profound grief that it seemed to shake the very mountains. The Appalachian tragedy was over, but for Sheriff Thornton, the real mystery was just beginning. The 9 caskets were buried side by side in the small church cemetery. There was a bitter fight over whether Isaiah, a man who had murdered his entire family, deserved to lie in consecrated ground. But Reverend Morrison, his face aged 10 years in as many days, insisted. This man was a victim as much as he was a perpetrator, he argued. He was consumed by an evil he could not understand. We will not commit his soul to darkness. We will pray for his mercy. The community, shattered and confused, relented. The story exploded. Newspapers in Richmond, even as far as Charleston, called it the Mountain Massacre. Journalists flocked to Greenbrier, but the locals met them with cold silence and suspicion. They wanted to forget. They wanted to bury this story with the bodies. But Sheriff Thornton couldn't. He had too many questions. Isaiah wrote that he fulfilled the covenant. But what if he was wrong? What if the cycle wasn't broken? What if, in another 40 years, some other poor soul found that cursed book and this all happened again? He had to know. Where did this evil come from? He locked himself in his office with the archives. He wasn't investigating the Hadleys anymore. He was investigating Sarah Blackwood. He dug into the original trial records from 1797, brittle yellow documents stored in a dusty basement. And what he found painted a very, very different picture. Sarah Blackwood hadn't been some shadowy crone. She had been a healer, a midwife, a woman respected and perhaps a little feared for her knowledge of herbs, a knowledge passed down through her family for generations. Then in 1791, a mysterious illness swept through her community. It struck the children first, high fevers, delirium, convulsions. Sarah worked frantically, using every treatment she knew, but one by one, 6 children died. Among them were Sarah's own 2 children, a boy of 8 and a girl of 6. The community, shattered by grief and desperate for someone to blame, turned on the one person who had been present at every death, the healer. Whispers started. Her herbs were poison. She was experimenting. The whispers turned to accusations. She was formally charged with witchcraft and murder. The trial, Thornton read, was a sham. It lasted 2 days. Witnesses claimed they'd seen her talking to trees, walking the mountains at night. The desperate, grieving actions of a mother who had lost everything, twisted into proof of dark magic. Thornton found the executioner's log. Sarah Blackwood was led to the gallows on March 15th, 1797. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. But just before the platform dropped, she spoke. Her last words were recorded by the clerk. You kill an innocent and call it justice. Then let the mountains remember this injustice. Let every generation pay the price for the blood you spilled today, not by my hand, for I am dead, but by the tormented souls of those who will come to see. The weight of your guilt will be your curse. Thornton dropped the papers. It wasn't a pact. It was a curse. A curse born of a broken-hearted mother's rage and despair. She hadn't started a ritual of sacrifice. She had just spoken words of vengeance. But those words, planted in the superstitious soil of the mountains, had taken root. Thornton went back to the list of 17 names from the book. He cross-referenced them with the trial records. His blood ran cold. Elizabeth Warren, the first victim, she was the daughter of the judge who presided over the trial. Jonathan Pierce, the grandson of the man who first publicly accused Sarah. Mary Sullivan, the niece of a key witness. One by one, he checked them all. Every single person on that list was a direct descendant of the jury, the witnesses, the judge, the people who had sent an innocent woman to her death. And Isaiah Hadley? Thornton searched the records, his hands shaking. He found it. Isaiah's great-grandfather had been the executioner, the man who put the rope around Sarah Blackwood's neck. There was no ancient hunger. There was no mountain demon. There was only the crushing, inescapable weight of generational guilt. A guilt so powerful it had driven 17 people over 40 years to madness and death. Isaiah had found the book, learned the secret of his family's sin, and in his tormented mind, the only way to pay the blood debt his ancestor had incurred was with the blood of his own family. The tragedy was complete. Or was it? A single, nagging question remained. How? How did each of these people, decades apart, just happen to find that book? How did they learn of the curse? Isaiah's letter to the Reverend Thornton snatched it up and read it again. The old man told me where to find the book. He said it was my turn to carry the burden, as he had before me. What old man? Sheriff Thornton began a new investigation, a quiet one. He rode from homestead to homestead, not asking about the Hadleys, but about a mysterious old man. For days he got nothing. Then a name, a hermit, a man named Ezekiel Marsh. lived high in the mountains north of the plateau. No one knew where he came from. They just said he was ancient, as old as the mountains themselves. Thornton gathered 4 of his best men. This time they weren't going on a rescue. They were going on a hunt. It took 3 days of hard riding and climbing, following vague trails, but they finally found it. A primitive cabin built right into the side of a cliff, almost invisible. Smoke drifted from its chimney. Thornton approached, his hand on his pistol, and knocked. The door creaked open. The man who stood there was impossibly old, stooped, wrinkled like leather, but his eyes were sharp, clear, and burning with a piercing intelligence. He looked at Thornton, and a slow, thin smile spread across his face. "I've been waiting for you, Sheriff," Ezekiel Marsh said, his voice a dry rustle. "It took you longer than I thought. Come in, I have tea. I imagine you have questions." The cabin was neat, filled with shelves of herbs and old stacked books. Ezekiel poured tea into pewter mugs, his hands surprisingly steady. "You knew Isaiah Hadley," Thornton said. It wasn't a question. "Oh, yes," Ezekiel nodded. "I knew Isaiah, just as I knew the others before him, all 17. I found each one. I guided each one. I suppose you want to know why?" You guided them?" Thornton felt a surge of rage. "You led them to their deaths. You gave them that book. You planted this curse in their minds. You're a monster." Ezekiel sipped his tea unfazed. "Monster? Yes, a fair word. But before you pass judgment, Sheriff, let me tell you my story." He stood, walked to an old wooden chest, and took out something wrapped in cloth. He unrolled it on the table. It was a silver locket, tarnished with age. He opened it. Inside was a miniature portrait of a young, kind-eyed woman. "Sarah Blackwood," Ezekiel said, his voice cracking for the first time. "My sister." Thornton stared. "I was 15 when they hanged her," Ezekiel whispered, his eyes distant, lost in a 40-year-old memory. "I saw it. I saw the crowd scream for her blood. I saw the judge. I saw you and his ancestor, the executioner. I saw my sister, an innocent healer, a mother who had just lost her own babies, murdered by a town full of cowards. And I swore, as her body swung, that there would be justice, a deeper justice." He sat back down. "I spent years learning. I traveled. I learned how the mind works, how guilt can be forged into a weapon. And then I came back." "The book," Thornton breathed. "Sarah's book was just a healer's journal," Ezekiel said. "Recipes, prayers. I added the other pages. I invented the symbols. I wrote the rituals, the pact, the curse. I turned an innocent diary into a psychological trap. Then I sought them out. The descendants. I didn't have to do much. Just wait till one of them heard the old family rumors, felt that first prick of inherited guilt. Then I'd appear, a harmless old man. I'd tell them a story. I'd hint at where a dark secret book might be buried." "I didn't kill them, Sheriff," Ezekiel said, his eyes locking on Thornton's. "I just provided the fuel. Their own guilt, their own fear, they lit the fire. They destroyed themselves." "This isn't justice," Thornton snarled, his hand gripping his pistol. "This is murder. 17, my God. The children, the Hadley children, they had nothing to do with this." "No," Ezekiel agreed, his face clouding. "It's not justice. I realize that. Too late. When you live on hatred for 40 years, it's not easy to stop. It's who you are." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Isaiah, he was different. He was so good he fought it. I read the letters he sent the Reverend. And when I read his last one, when I knew he was taking the children, little Hannah." The old man broke. He put his head in his hands, his body shaking with a dry, racking sob. "I went up to the cave that night," he choked out. I was going to stop him, but I was too late. They had all taken the poison. They were lying there in that circle, sleeping. Isaiah was last. He was still conscious. He saw me, and he smiled. He thought I was some angel. come to see him off. He said, it's done. The cycle is broken. And then he died. I stood there, Sheriff. I stood in that cave and watched 9 innocent people die, and I finally understood the monster I had become. My sister, my Sarah, she spent her life saving children, and I spent mine using her memory to kill them. I betrayed her. I betrayed everything. The room was silent. Then Ezekiel said one last thing. There's something else, something I found 5 years ago, too late. He went back to the chest and pulled out a yellowed, folded letter. I found this hidden in the floorboards of her old house just before it collapsed. Thornton took it. It was Sarah's handwriting, a letter written the night before her execution. He read it aloud. It was a declaration of her innocence, her grief over her children, and then the last lines. I do not know if I will curse them or die in silence, but if I choose the curse, let it be known they are just words. I have no power. Their own guilt is curse enough. If my brother Ezekiel still lives, I hope he finds peace. I do not want revenge. I just want to be remembered as I was, a mother, a healer. May God bless those who cursed me, for they know not what they do. Thornton finished reading and looked at the old man. Ezekiel Marsh was weeping openly, tears of 4 decades streaming down his face. She asked me for peace, he cried, and I gave her 40 years of blood. I ignored her last wish. And for what? For what? Sheriff Thornton stood up. Ezekiel Marsh, he said, his voice heavy as stone, you will be taken to Lewisburg. You will be tried for 17 murders. Ezekiel nodded, a strange look of relief on his face. Yes, he whispered. It's fitting. My sister was hanged innocent. I will hang guilty. The circle finally closes. Ezekiel Marsh's trial was the sensation of the decade. The courtroom in Lewisburg was packed every single day. The prosecutor laid out the entire decades-long story of psychological torture and manipulation. Ezekiel's defense tried to plead insanity, that a man's grief had broken his mind, but Ezekiel himself refused it. He stood before the court, frail but defiant. I am not insane, he said, his voice clear. I was consumed by hatred, but I knew exactly what I was doing. I planned every step. I will not hide. 17 people are dead because of the seeds I planted. I do not ask for mercy, for I showed none. I ask only that my story be a warning. Injustice breeds injustice. Revenge brings no peace. It only creates more pain. The jury took 6 hours. The verdict was guilty. On December 22nd, 1834, just a week before Christmas, Ezekiel Marsh was led to the gallows in the same town square where his sister had died. He refused the hood. When asked for his last words, he looked at the crowd. My sister died innocent, cursing those who condemned her. I die guilty, but at peace. I finally understand what she tried to tell me. Revenge does not honor the dead. It only creates more death. Break the cycle. Don't be like me. The platform fell, and the man who had orchestrated 40 years of death, the man who had turned his own sister's memory into a weapon, was gone. In the weeks that followed, Sheriff Thornton took a team of men back up to the high plateau. Following Ezekiel's last request, they used gunpowder and steel to seal the cave. They brought tons of rock down, burying the entrance forever, erasing that scar from the mountain. They tore apart the stone circle. And back in Lewisburg, Sheriff Thornton held a public burning. He threw Sarah Blackwood's original journal and all of Ezekiel's cursed, faked copies into a roaring bonfire. He watched until every last page, every last symbol, every last lie was nothing but ash scattered to the winds. The Hadley homestead was abandoned. The forest moved back in, swallowing the house, the barn, the fields, until nothing was left but a few moss-covered foundation stones. The story, though the story survived, it became a legend in those mountains, a dark, cautionary tale about what happens when grief turns to vengeance and how the guilt of the past can poison the future. It's a story about how the most terrifying monsters aren't demons or spirits in the woods. The most terrifying monsters are the ones we create ourselves. If this story made you think, if it gave you chills, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. We've got a lot more dark histories to dig up, and let me know in the comments. Do you believe a curse can be real, or is it always just the darkness inside the human heart? Thanks for watching.